Welcome back to Changemaker Q&A, everybody. This episode is part 2 of our 2-part episode on disaster preparedness and the humanitarian and development sector more broadly. So in last week's episode, I discussed the importance of disaster preparedness in terms of something that we all need to be aware of as individuals and what it means to be prepared for a disaster, having an emergency kit ready. And then we looked at the importance of disaster preparedness in the work that we might be doing across the social change space. So we looked at the intersection of social justice and disaster preparedness and looked at preparedness as a bit of a strategy or a mechanism for building resilience. And we looked at resilience as this emergent property of a system, whether that is an individual, a community, or a country, when the system has these 3 core capacities, those capacities being the ability to stabilize after it has experienced some kind of shock or stressor, the capacity to adapt and make these small changes, particularly in terms of removing barriers or challenges that present themselves that would otherwise be preventing a desired state from occurring, and the third of those being the capacity for transformation, which is the ability of the system to create something new, to create new changes, to transform itself, or create something that is like qualitatively different to the things that were used to create that change. So the capacities to transform, adapt, and stabilize are what cause resilience in a system. And that is largely based on a lot of my own personal doctoral research. What we're going to be looking at in this episode is specifically looking at how disaster preparedness and humanitarian relief fit into the broader humanitarian and development sectors and the role that these sectors play in the social change ecosystem. So if you are familiar with our social change handbook, The Changemaker in You, and if you have seen our kind of core framework that we use for understanding social change, then you would probably be familiar with the 4th type of change in our social change framework, which is systemic changes that are informal. So in our little social change framework, these are in the bottom left quarter of our quadrant, and it is essentially all the things that change norms, practices, and living conditions for people in a society. So these are changes to any kind of institution, whether that's healthcare, education, justice, that is outside officially sanctioned channels like policy and legislation. So this is essentially all about allowing institutions and systems to improve the realities for communities through their ability to shape any kind of cultural norms, living conditions, or daily practices. So this is where a lot of the work that happens in the humanitarian and particularly the development sector occurs. So the international development sector and the humanitarian sector is a $1 trillion industry. This would make it the equivalent of the 8th largest economy in the world, and it employs over 18 million people. So this might seem like a vast amount of money, but research actually suggests that in order to achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, this would require an additional $5 trillion. Now, as a result, this means that financial resources are considered to be relatively scarce in the humanitarian and development sectors, despite the scale and impact of these sectors. Now, if you are maybe considering a career in the humanitarian or development sector, or you're just wondering what these sectors actually entail and how they fit into the social change ecosystem, the role of a professional humanitarian is essentially to promote human welfare and social reform. And there's typically an understanding that there is no prejudice, which means this sector is about helping everybody. It doesn't leave people out. There are no exclusionary practices. And we see this with some of the larger humanitarian organizations. I think the Red Cross is probably the one that comes to mind for most people. And the Red Cross has these kind of core principles of neutrality, impartiality, independence, which means in a conflict zone, for example, they don't prioritize people from any side of the conflict. Their goal in a conflict zone is to support anybody that needs support. So, understanding how the humanitarian sector functions, the actors that are involved, and the different tasks that might be assigned to stakeholders is going to be really valuable, especially for those of you who might be considering a career in this field, or if you're just interested in understanding this sector more generally. So when we talk about the humanitarian or development sector, it's typically made up of 3 different subsectors. And we could think of these subsectors as like a bit of a triple Venn diagram. So we have the humanitarian subsector, we have the international or development subsector, and then we have the stabilization subsector. And each of these sectors, they operate at different scales. So they begin at the grassroots and community level, they extend up to the rural or urban levels, the state or provincial levels, national, regional, all the way up to international or even transnational levels. The humanitarian subsector is primarily concerned with responding to crises and emergencies, providing any immediate life-saving aid such as food, shelter, or medical assistance following a disaster or a conflict. The development subsector, in contrast, largely deals with those longer-term social and economic progress goals, aiming to enhance human capabilities and create sustainable systems that enable communities to thrive. The stabilization subsector sits at the intersection of these two, and this typically works in conflict-affected or fragile states to try to restore security, governance, and political stability through a combination of civilian, military, and diplomatic efforts. So each subsector has its own distinct goals and approaches, but they do often overlap, particularly in a post-crisis recovery situation, where sometimes we see stabilization efforts supporting humanitarian relief and those longer-term development initiatives. It's important to note that while both the humanitarian and development sectors have that element of neutrality and it's about supporting all people, and oftentimes it happens independently of the government or the state, the stabilization subsector is the one that explicitly deals with the military and the state, typically because one of its key aims is to establish some kind of political or military stability in that region. So that is the one sector of those 3 subsectors that explicitly deals with political issues. We begin with the humanitarian subsector. And the humanitarian sector primarily responds to disasters and emergencies. And there are 6 key stages. A lot of organizations will break it down into the 4 main stages of disaster recovery, but we can think of the 6 different stages in the ways in which they sometimes overlap with the development sector as well. The first stage is that initial response. This is what we might think of as like search and rescue. Immediately following a disaster, the priority is obviously going to be to locate and rescue any survivors. And this phase typically involves emergency responders, medical teams, and logistics specialists who are coordinating those life-saving efforts in affected areas. Time is really critical here. It's probably the most important resource here, as the window for rescuing people who might be trapped or injured typically narrows quite rapidly. The second stage is relief, and this is where we're typically providing people with food, shelter, sanitation. Then shifts to meeting people's most basic needs, so food, water, shelter, sanitation. Humanitarian organizations will often distribute emergency supplies. They will establish temporary shelters and provide urgent medical care to prevent any disease outbreaks. The third stage is the rehabilitation stage, and this is when basic services are typically restored. In this phase, attention then turns to restoring those essential services. So things like water supply, healthcare, education, and this is a transitional stage that ensures any affected communities can try to begin to regain a sense of stability even before those full-scale reconstruction efforts begin. The fourth stage is then reconstruction, and this is where we're aiming to have a full recovery of services. So these are those longer term rebuilding efforts that we might see after something like fires or floods or cyclones, when we're focusing on reconstructing homes, fixing key infrastructure, and restoring all public services. This stage typically engages engineers, urban planners, and also policymakers to try to rebuild communities in a way that also enhances resilience for future disasters. The fifth stage is then the mitigation stage, and this is where we see a lot of risk assessment and prevention efforts happening. So mitigation efforts involve identifying any potential risks and implementing measures to reduce vulnerabilities. This can include enforcing building codes, developing early warning systems, and investing in sustainable infrastructure that can ultimately withstand future crises. The final and sixth stage is preparedness, and this is where we see a lot of contingency planning and preparing for future emergencies. So the final stage involves proactive planning to ensure that there is a swift response to any future disasters. This includes training emergency responders, stockpiling essential supplies, and educating communities on disaster preparedness. It's this preparedness phase in particular that kind of serves as that crucial link between the humanitarian aid and the international development sectors. Once communities are better prepared for future emergencies, the focus transitions towards longer term development efforts. And so this is where we get to the role of the development sector. So while the humanitarian sector is addressing those immediate crises, the international development sector is working to create sustainable solutions that enhance longer-term resilience for communities. So the development sector operates with two core objectives. The first is to directly enhance human abilities. So this can involve equipping individuals and communities with the necessary knowledge, skills, and resources to improve their quality of life. This includes a lot of programs that target education, vocational training, or healthcare initiatives. And then there are those that aim to create an enabling environment for development. So beyond those individual capacity building programs, there are development practitioners that will work to establish all of the systemic conditions necessary for sustained progress. This can include strengthening governance, improving infrastructure, and fostering more economic opportunities. The development sector is a fascinating sector, and if you're curious about the types of areas that development actors might work in, if you're not familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, I definitely recommend you look up the SDGs, or you can listen to our previous episode. If you want to listen to our episode 7 from this season of the podcast, looked at the transition from the United Nations Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals, and it gives you a nice overview of the 17 SDGs, as well as some challenges for the SDG framework. But that is a good framework for getting a bit of an overview of the types of areas that development actors might work in. So the SDGs made up of 17 goals, and these goals are no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and partnerships for the goals. So those are the 17 goals, and they're the areas that a lot of development actors will typically work in. There are a number of different approaches to development. There are needs-based approaches. There are participatory approaches. My PhD research obviously looked at empowerment-focused approaches to development. It is a fascinating sector, one that has a history that is inextricably linked to colonialism and this notion of modernity, as it is one that is inextricably linked to notions of modernity and coloniality. And so it has a very problematic past and can sometimes still be a little bit problematic. So if you have any questions about the development sector, definitely feel free to either ask those at our website, or you can just leave them as a comment on Spotify or YouTube, and I would be happy to dive into them because I think the development sector is fascinating. But that is essentially the work of the development sector and how it links in to the humanitarian sector. The stabilization subsector is what bridges a lot of humanitarian and development work in those conflict zones. So it exists at the intersection of humanitarian response and international development, and it typically involves efforts to reduce violence, re-establish security, and promote political stability in those post-conflict or disaster-affected areas. Unlike the humanitarian and development sectors, which operate on those principles of neutrality and independence, stabilization efforts, like I mentioned, do often involve a coordinated effort between civilian and military actions to try and foster a little bit more structural stability. There are a whole range of different actors that are working across the humanitarian and development sectors. So they all play distinct but interconnected roles. So in both the humanitarian and development subsectors, we have a lot of civil society organizations, so local community groups, non-government organizations, and grassroots groups that work directly with affected populations. We also see a lot of international NGOs, so those large-scale humanitarian organizations like the Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, who are there to provide immediate relief and support longer-term recovery. Obviously, a lot of government agencies as well. So there are national and international government bodies that will coordinate disaster responses and fund a lot of recovery efforts. There are private sector actors. So there are a lot of businesses that will provide financial support, technological innovations, and a lot of logistical expertise for humanitarian or development operations. And of course, a big actor is organizations that are part of the United Nations. So a lot of UN agencies, World Food Programme, the UNHCR, UNICEF, all of these different UN agencies play a really crucial role in global emergency response and also the coordination of policy in these areas. So we do see a lot of different types of actors across sectors. There are public sector actors, there are private sector actors, and there are civil society sector actors right across the humanitarian and development space. I think a lot of the time we might think that it is just government or NGOs, but there are a range of different actors in both of these subsectors. If you were interested in perhaps pursuing a career in any of these sectors, there's a whole range of different ways to go about it. There are approaches that you can take in terms of gaining entry points into these sectors, like a lot of volunteering or internships. So a lot of professionals will begin by working with NGOs and getting that hands-on experience in a disaster-affected area before they maybe pursue a professional career. This is a sector that relies on a lot of technical expertise. So a lot of engineers, medical professionals, logisticians, data analysts are always in pretty high demand across different humanitarian roles. Project management is another big one. So the ability to be able to coordinate those large-scale humanitarian projects requires skills in project management, monitoring, and evaluation. And of course, there are a lot of policy and advocacy roles as well. So being able to shape those humanitarian or development policies and also securing funding for aid programs are really critical components of the sector. So if you are maybe thinking about a career in the humanitarian or development space, these are some really good entry points to maybe consider. I hope that was interesting for you. I hope that kind of gives you a bit of an understanding of how this sector works and how it fits into the broader social change space. Like I mentioned, a lot of these efforts typically target informal systemic changes. And it's a really interesting space that I think if you don't have a lot of experience or like a bit of an understanding of, it can seem a bit elusive. So I hope that kind of clarifies things for you. If you have any questions about anything that we discussed in this episode, obviously definitely feel free to ask those questions. And if you haven't read our social change handbook, The Changemaker and You, I encourage you to give that one a read. You can get the ebook for free and you can listen to it as an audiobook also for free. via the School of Social Impact. It's on the website's homepage and the resources page. It's part of our beginner change making essentials bundle. So you'll get the ebook, the audiobook, a video training series, and a worksheet to work through. So definitely check that one out if you found this interesting and you'd like to learn a little bit more about different approaches to change through our social change framework.